Hey everybody, we're starting a brand new chapter right now talking about vertebrate animals. And just for the sake of the situation we find ourselves in, I've kind of taken this chapter and I've condensed it. And we're limiting our discussion to just two major groups of vertebrate animals. Before we move forward, I think it's important to talk about just what a vertebrate animal is. So, chapter 11 was all about invertebrates. So, an invertebrate is any kind of animal that lacks a backbone. So we're moving and we are going to be placing our attention in vertebrate animals, and these are animals that do have a backbone, or shall we say backbones, because that's really what vertebrae are. So a backbone is not just one single bone, it's actually several interlocking bones that are going to give shape and support to an animal, and generally are also going to house the central nervous system. So in human beings, we have a spine, and that spinal column helps to support this large nerve that's running down the length of our back and connecting to the base of our brain. And that's what allows our brain to communicate to the rest of our body. Okay, so just as a quick reminder, so birds, mammals, that's where we're going to be going for the next couple days here and a couple weeks. They are vertebrate species. Now, we are going to be kind of skipping through, not talking about reptiles, amphibians, or fish. We're just sticking with sections 5 and 6 for now. Now, one of the things that both birds and mammals are going to have in common is they're both endothermic. Okay. Now, you've probably heard the term hot-blooded or warm-blooded animals or cold-blooded. These are kind of inaccurate terms. They're not terms that scientists use. You've probably heard that, say, reptiles or fish are cold-blooded, while birds and mammals are warm-blooded. The word that scientists use is either ectothermic or endothermic, and these are vocab terms. The reason I mention this is because it can kind of be a little misleading. Because if you think about certain types of reptiles, even though their blood can, be measured in lower temperatures, it's possible for a quote unquote cold blooded animal for its body temperature to rise above even a warm blooded animal's. And that is because reptile blood isn't necessarily always cold. It's more doing with the fact that animals are able to get their body heat from different sources. So if you are or if your body temperature or your blood temperature is determined by your environment, that's going to mean you're an ectotherm. So that's going to be like fish, reptiles, amphibians. Their body temperature is dependent upon their environment. All right. So if you think about a snake living in the desert, where temperatures get very high, the body temperature of that reptile could be, say, far higher than yours. So we don't really use the term warm-blooded versus cold-blooded, but endotherm and ectotherm. So mammals and human beings fall into that group, as well as birds. They're going to be endothermic, meaning that we are organisms that are able to generate our own body heat. Okay, and that's one of the things that defines a bird and sets it apart from other types of vertebrates that we find. So when we think about birds, we often think that, well, a bird is an animal that can fly. And for the vast majority of birds, that is true. But let's not forget that there are certain types of flightless birds that remain on the ground. Ostriches and penguins are just some examples of those. So when we think bird, don't necessarily think flight, even though many of them can fly. It's not one of the things that all birds are going to have in common. However, all birds, no matter what, are always going to have feathers. And those feathers can have some different functions, all right? And we'll talk about that in a moment. I think it is important that we talk a little bit about the heart chambers of both birds and mammals, because they're going to be very similar. But obviously, birds are also going to be animals that lay eggs. Their eggs are going to have a tough outer shell, kind of different from reptile eggs. If you've ever felt a reptile egg before, they don't feel like birds' eggs. They'll kind of have a leathery, soft coating on the outside of them. But we are going to move on talking about we mentioned the difference between an endotherm and an ectotherm. So an endothermic animal, these are animals that generate their own body heat. And one of the advantages there is that if you are a cold-blooded animal on a cold morning or a cold environment, you're going to be moving very slowly. You're going to be very sluggish. And so those animals are going to try to warm themselves up somehow, which is why you might see like turtles or lizards sunning themselves on a rock. They're going to try to raise their body temperature, and that's going to either help them obtain food or escape from predators. All right. So one of the advantages that an endotherm is going to have over an ectotherm is that endothermic, warm-blooded animals have the ability to maintain a consistent and constant body temperature. And so when they need to move quickly, they can do that very easily. One of the disadvantages, however, is that endotherms are going to need a whole lot of energy to maintain that high body temperature. So it means they're going to have to eat more often. Certain types of reptiles can actually go for months without a meal because they're just masters of conserving energy. But endotherms need to eat quite often and a lot. Okay. So just kind of taking a look at, this is a very simple diagram of different cardiovascular systems. So cardiovascular, just talking about the heart and blood vessels of animals, all right? And so like fish are gonna have a very simple cardiovascular system with a two-chambered heart. And you can see that they're represented oxygenated blood here in the red. That's gonna be oxygen-rich blood. And in the blue, that's going to be oxygen-starved blood. One of the things you can see is that in amphibians and reptiles, instead of having a two-chambered heart, they have a three-chambered heart. And here in this chamber here, it's called the ventricle, you can see that some of the red and blue blood, it's mixing together to make purple. In other words, you have oxygen-starved blood mixing with oxygen-rich blood in the ventricle, and that's what's being delivered to the different body systems. Now, it's not as efficient as, say, birds and mammals that have a four-chambered heart. Now, one of the advantages of the four-chambered heart is if you look very closely here on the slide, you can see that the oxygenated blood stays separate from the deoxygenated blood. So basically what's happening is blood is going to enter the heart through one of these chambers, gets pumped out to the lungs, which is where they're going to pick up oxygen. So every time you take a breath, you are taking deoxygenated blood, it's getting pumped through your lungs and getting reinvigorated with oxygen, all right? And that is going to return to the heart, where it's then pumped out again to the rest of the body systems. So unlike amphibians and most types of reptiles, instead of getting this mixture of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, this kind of a cardiovascular system ensures that you are getting pure oxygenated blood. And your body systems are really going to need it, okay? Especially when we're talking about birds, all right? So even though I mentioned earlier that not all birds can fly, we are going to talk about different adaptations for birds that can fly. So what is allowing them, or what is true about their bodies that's going to allow them to achieve flight, okay? So moving on to adaptations for flight. And you can find this if you go to page 481. All right, so obviously, one of the things that are going to be necessary for birds to achieve flight is going to be feathers, okay? What a lot of people may not know is that bird bodies are extremely light, okay? So for its size, even larger birds are surprisingly light in weight, and that's because they have hollows and air sacs in their bones that are going to allow them to have a very low body weight, and that's very important if you're trying to get off the ground, whereas say mammals might have a very dense bone structure. Now there is a trade-off here. So while bird bones are light and allows them to fly, they're also going to be very brittle and easy to break. Okay, so there is a bit of a trade-off there. Birds also have very powerful chest muscles that are going to allow them to beat their wings very quickly, depending on the kind of bird. So different birds might have different flight patterns or flight styles, you might refer to them as. Like a hummingbird is going to beat its wings like 60 times per second, whereas other larger birds like condors or albatross, instead of trying to beat their wings very quickly to achieve flight, they'll rely on gliding more often. Okay, so the feathers themselves are actually going to have a couple of different functions. Right? So not all feathers on the bird are for flight necessarily. Okay, so the feathers that are used for flight are going to be called contour feathers. Those contour feathers are designed in such a way as that they have these interlocking hooks and barbs that are going to create a proper flight surface. All right, so as that bird is flapping its wings, it's making use of the air that gets trapped under those flight feathers. And then it's going to allow that bird to glide or balance themselves and steer as they're moving through the air. Other types of feathers, known as down feathers, their primary purpose is going to be to trap heat and maintain warmth. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why birds can actually be found in just about every single continent that you find. So every continent on Earth has birds of some sort living on them, even in very cold environments. So you think like penguins, they have to maintain that body temperature. So their feathers are designed to trap in as much heat as possible. Okay. So earlier we mentioned that in birds and mammal cardiovascular systems, obtaining oxygen is very important, getting that from the lungs. And bird lungs are very interesting. So they're designed in such a way that they have many air sacs, kind of these extra pouches that give their lungs extra surface area. So if you were to examine a bird's body and kind of compare the size of its lungs to its overall body, the lungs are going to take up way more space than in their body than say like a mammal's lungs in its body. And that's because birds, in order to achieve flight, have to supercharge their blood with oxygen. And that's why you have all these different air sacs and pouches leading off the lungs. It's going to increase the surface area of the lung, which means that oxygen can get into the bloodstream much more efficiently and quickly than say like in a mammal's. Now, in order to maintain the energy for flight, birds need to eat a lot. So if anyone's ever told you like, did you know you eat like a bird? Really what they're trying to say is, you eat very little. But in truth, birds need to eat like a third or a quarter of their body weight every single day, right? So that would be like you eating like 100 cheeseburger patties every single day. It's absolutely nuts, okay? So in order to feed the way they do, birds are going to swallow their food whole, or at least they'll, in some cases, like chip off little bits of it. That's because birds, even though they have those sharp and powerful beaks, they don't have teeth for chewing, all right? So a bird is not going to chew their food like you and I do. They're going to swallow it whole, and that's going to lead to a special little holding pouch called a crop. The crop is usually just kind of a storage pouch for food, where eventually it gets passed to what's known as the gizzard. Now the gizzard, in many cases, birds will actually often swallow stones, and those stones will get trapped in the gizzard, and they kind of act like teeth, because basically the gizzard is a strong muscular pouch that will squeeze and grind their food up. And as it's being squeezed, those stones in the bird's gizzard are going to help to grind up their food. It's one of the reasons why, so like if you own chickens or have certain birds that you might raise, one of the things you give them is grit, and that grit is basically stones that ends up in the gizzard, and that's how they're going to chew their food. Okay, so while we're talking about food, it's also important to mention that bird beaks come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and that's because they're going to have a bunch of different functions. So depending on the bird beak type, they're going to have a different diet or food source. So for example, hummingbirds have that long, thin snout, and you can actually see here, hummingbirds have this long, retractable tongue that's going to allow them to reach into flowers to be able to sap up that nectar, whereas say like hawks, eagles, and other predatory birds are going to have these long hooked and sharp pointed beaks that are going to allow them to grasp onto prey. I think it's absolutely insane that you have birds that are going to like pound their faces against tree trunks without getting a concussion. So like woodpeckers, their beaks are designed in such a way as that they're going to cushion the blow so that the woodpecker doesn't damage its brain as it's pounding into that tree, basically hammering into that tree to look for insects. And once it's made a hole, that, like a hummingbird, they also have a long tongue that's going to allow them to extract insects from the holes they're making in trees. Pelicans, man, have such funky beaks. So they have a large pouch or a wattle on the underside. And basically their way of feeding is they're just going to, in some cases, dive into the water, gulp up as much water as they can, and basically strain out any fish that they're able to catch. Whereas ducks will often have a wide, broad snout, and that's going to help them as they're going underwater for small little animals and plants underwater. So the beak type of a bird is going to determine what kind of food it's going to be eating. As far as reproduction, all birds rely on what's referred to as internal fertilization. This is going to be as opposed to like fish or certain types of amphibians, where fertilization, the coming together of sex cells is going to happen outside of their body. So you think like salmon will swim upstream for miles for spawning, and spawning is basically where the reproduction is occurring outside of the fish bodies. Birds and mammals are going to rely on internal fertilization. Okay, so the meeting of those sex cells is going to happen inside the female's body. They're going to lay eggs that in many cases have to be watched very carefully. So unlike certain types of reptiles that can lay their eggs and leave them, so say like certain types of sea turtles will wash up on a beach, dig a hole, lay their eggs, cover up the eggs, and then they're gone and they never see their babies again. Birds have to be very attentive parents because they have to maintain that body temperature. If eggs were left alone, they wouldn't be able to survive because they could cool down very quickly. The embryo developing inside would die, and you wouldn't have any baby birds. Okay, so they have to be cared for very, very protectively. In addition to that, when they hatch, the babies are pretty much helpless and depend on their parents for the food that they receive. So whether it's mama bird bringing some worms that she's regurgitated, or mama penguin, bringing back some fish that she's caught out in the sea. The babies are very much reliant on their parents. Okay, unlike some other types of vertebrate species. Okay, and that brings us to the end of our section on birds. We are eventually going to move on to mammals, but just say look for the next video, and we'll talk about them. Cool.